In our last lesson, we started looking at the question of climax in more depth. Now we'll look at some more examples where climax is much more subtle than in the Mahler example. We've mentioned that climax is closely related to the progression principle. Let's see how this works out in a rather introspective piece, Brahms' Intermezzo, Opus 117, number 2. Let's listen. The piece starts off with its main idea in B-flat minor. The first high point is the A-flat in measure 2. In the following bars, the melody goes gradually lower, first to G-flat in measure 3, then to F in measure 4. Then it goes even lower, hovering around D-flat and slowing the harmonic rhythm in measure 8 and 9. The music is more static here, over the half-diminished chord on E-flat. This dissonant harmony maintains some suspense despite the diminuendo and the general slowing down. When the main idea starts again in measure 9 and 10, this time it achieves a new peak, the B-flat in measure 11. But as in the first presentation, the music gradually descends afterwards. In measure 17, we arrive again at the A-flat, but this too subsequently descends, again arriving at a point of stasis in measure 21-22. These mainly descending phrases help to create the ruminating, introverted character Brahms is expressing here. A quick dramatic rise would create a kind of energy inappropriate to this mood. Now let's see what follows. In measure 22, the second section of the piece begins with a slower variant of the main motive in D flat major. Its highest note is the B flat, attained already in measure 24. This local peak won't be surpassed in this section. Within this section, there's some contrast of register, for example in measure 23 and 31. The main idea comes back starting in measure 38. This time it gradually rises from F in measure 39 to A flat in measure 40, then to B flat in measure 41. So the energy is more dynamic now. Notice how the bass, in inverted imitation, rises as well in these bars, changing register several times. Although the peak doesn't go beyond the B we heard in measure 41, measure 43 to 46 fall and rise quickly with simple arpeggio figures. Then we reach a new high point with the high D flat at the end of measure 46, which returns in measure 49. This sinks back into the middle register in measures 50-51. Starting in measure 51, there's a variation of the opening presentation, which comes to a quiet moment as before in measure 59 to 60, again attaining the high D flat. So overall, this section has not risen to any new heights. Its role seems to be more to balance the form. I'll have more to say about this kind of balancing in coming lessons. The music restarts yet again in measure 60-61, but now it rises continually through G flat in measure 62, A flat in measure 64, and D flat in measure 65. Then in measure 69, we reach a loud higher peak on E flat. This is the peak of the whole piece, reinforced by the grace note in the right hand and the thick left-hand chord. Notice how the opening idea has now changed character, becoming more energetic to lead up to the main climax. Then we descend in measure 70-71 to land on a slower reprise of the variant of the main motive that we first heard at the end of measure 22. But this time it takes place over a long dominant pedal underlying two rising waves. The second wave is lower than the first, so it's clear the music direction here is not rising as it was in the previous section. The figuration never gets as high as it did at the climax in measure 69, but the harmony over the pedal point does create tension before the final cadence. Notice that when the tonic B flat minor does finally arrive in measure 83 to 85, the piano's arpeggio contains both the lowest note in the whole piece in measure 83 and the highest in the last bar. There are a few interesting things here. Once again, we see the ending reaching extremes of register, giving us a feeling that we can't go any farther. Imagine how much less convincing the end would be if the arpeggio were confined just to the middle register. The other significant point here is that, overall, there still is a climax in measure 69, but it arrives in the penultimate section, not at the ending. So the progression principle is clearly at work here, but the timing and the overall mood of the piece are much less dramatic than in the Mahler. Rather like the Bach Allemande we looked at last time, there's a sense of progression overall, as well as tension preceding the cadence, but the emotional war is much more introspective. In our next lesson, we'll look at an example that would seem not to have a clear climax at all, a classical ternary form.